Seacoast defense was a major concern for the United States from its independence until World War II. Before airplanes, America's enemies could only reach her from the sea, making coastal forts an economical alternative to standing armies or a large navy. After the 1940s, it was recognized that fixed fortifications were obsolete and ineffective against aircraft and missiles. However, in prior eras, foreign fleets were a realistic threat, and substantial fortifications were built at key locations, especially protecting major harbors. The defenses heavily depended on fortifications but also included minefields, nets and booms, ships, and airplanes. Therefore, all of the armed forces participated in Seacoast defense, but the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers played the central role in constructing fixed defenses. Designs evolved and became obsolete with changes in the technology available to both the attacking forces and the defenders. The evolution of the U.S. Seacoast defense system is generally identified among several systems, which are somewhat defined by the styles used, but more so by the events or trends which periodically stimulated new funding and construction. The division of the early forts into the first and second systems was made by later historians, and appears officially in an 1851 report by Chief Engineer Joseph Totten, probably the most prolific builder of masonry forts in American history. Early defenses. At the beginning of the American Revolution, many coastal fortifications already protected the Atlantic coast. Prior to independence from Britain, local communities or colonies bore the cost and responsibility for their own protection. Urgency would wax and wane based on the political climate in Europe. Most defenses were artillery protected by earthworks, as protection from pirate raids and foreign incursions. Though seldom used, the forts were a deterrent. Additional forts, called Patriot batteries, were built during the Revolution, usually to meet specific threats. First system. When the United States gained independence in 1783, the Seacoast defense fortifications were in poor condition. Concerned by the outbreak of war in Europe in 1793, the Congress created a combined unit of artillerists and engineers to design, build, and garrison forts. In 1794, appointed a committee to study coast defense needs, and appropriated money to construct a number of fortifications that would become known as the First System. 20 significant forts at 13 harbors were approved for construction, mostly with traditional low-walled structures with low-sloped earthworks protecting wood or brick walls. The conventional wisdom was that soft earth would cushion the effect of cannon fire against the walls, and that low walls presented less exposure to projectiles. Walls were laid out at angles to each other, forming a system of bastions resembling a star layout, so that enemy forces could not mass against the bottom of the wall beneath the vertical field of fire from the wall. Defenders on any wall could see and fire on the base of the adjacent walls. The angled walls also reduced the chance for more destructive straight-on hits from cannonballs. Most first-system forts were relatively small, and with some exceptions mounted only one tier of cannon on the roof of the fort. Additional water batteries outside the fort provided more firepower. Lacking trained engineers to supervise the work, Secretary of War Henry Knox placed a number of European engineers under contract. Although some fine forts were constructed, for the most part enthusiasm and funding waned and little work was completed. Most of the partially finished earthworks and wooden structures deteriorated before they were needed to defend against the British in 1812. Second system. In 1802, Congress separated the artillerists and engineers into a separate corps and directed the Corps of Engineers to create a military academy at West Point, New York. One of the driving forces for establishing the new academy was the need to divorce the United States from its reliance on foreign engineers. In 1807 to 1808, new concerns over a possible war with Great Britain prompted President Thomas Jefferson to renew fortification programs. This has come to be known as the Second System. One common weakness among the typical low-walled open bastion-star forts was exposure to enemy fire, especially to new devices designed to explode in mid-air and rain shrapnel down on the gunners. Gun emplacements which were at an angle to the sea were vulnerable to a solid shot running parallel to the wall, taking out a row of guns and gunners, with one enfilading shot. In the late 1770s, a French engineer, the Marquis de Montalembert, advocated a major change in the design of fortresses to address these problems. His design protected a fort's gunners by placing most of them in covered casemate walls with openings for the guns. By stacking rows of casemates in high walls, more guns could be mounted along shorter walls. This was particularly important for seacoast fortifications, which had only a limited time in which to fire at passing enemy ships. To build these tall forts, walls had to be built of masonry, but be very thick in order to withstand the pounding of cannon fire. Despite the goal of building multi-tiered forts, only a few of these were completed, notably Castle Williams in New York Harbor. Most completed second-system forts generally resembled first-system forts, with a one-tier star fort supplemented by water batteries. The second system was distinguished from the first system by greater use of Montalembert's concepts and the replacement of foreign engineers by American ones, many of them recent graduates of the new United States Military Academy superintended by Major Jonathan Williams, who not only instructed the new engineers in new ideas of coastal defense, but also designed and constructed a prototype, Castle Williams on Governor's Island in New York Harbor. Again, several fine forts were produced, but generally projects went unfinished, and between the first system and second system little was prepared to resist the British in the coming War of 1812. However, no first system or second system fortress was captured by the British. The invasion of Baltimore was prevented by Fort McHenry on the peninsula to the rear in the west, a temporary naval battery across the Patapsco Channel to the east at Lazaretto Point, and the sunken ships blocking both channels on either side of McHenry, along with 20,000 militia dug in on the east side of the town at Laudenschläger's Hill, later Hampstead Hill, in today's Patterson Park. In some cases even incomplete forts were sufficient to deter attack from the sea. But, undefended and unfortified, Washington, D.C., the national capital, was burned after the land militia forces were routed at the Battle of Bladensburg northeast of the capital in Prince George's County, Maryland. Washington had one fort as Fort Washington on the Potomac River just below Alexandria, Virginia, whose commander ordered the magazine blown when the passing British fleet appeared nearby after the British had already occupied Washington. The present Fort Washington was built on the site of the destroyed Fort Washington in the early 1820s as part of the Third System. Among the many important and historic documents lost in the British burning of the Library of Congress were the plans to the first Fort Washington, and other Second System forts. Third System in 1816. Following the War of 1812, Congress appropriated over $800,000 for an ambitious seacoast defensive system which was known as the Third System. A board of engineers for fortifications, appointed by President James Madison, visited potential sites and prepared plans for the new forts. The board's original 1821 report established the policy which would remain in place for most of the 19th century. The original report suggested 50 sites, but by 1850 the board had identified nearly 200 sites for fortification. The Army built forts at 42 of these sites, with several additional sites containing towers or batteries. The forts were originally intended to mount mostly 42-pounder Seacoast guns. However, due to a shortage of these weapons, many 32-pounder Seacoast guns and 8-inch and 10-inch Columbiads were mounted instead. The main defensive works were often large structures based on combining the Montelembat concept, with many guns concentrated in tall, thick masonry walls, and the Vauban concept with layers of low, protected masonry walls. Most third-system forts had at least 2 tiers of cannon. The first and second system forts often had only 1 tier. Construction was generally overseen by officers of the Army's Corps of Engineers. Smaller works guarded less significant harbors. U.S. Army Engineer Officer Joseph Totten and former French Engineer Officer Simon Bernard designed the larger forts and key features of most of the smaller forts, such as the Totten casemate, which allowed a good field of fire with a minimal embrasure size. By the end of the third system in 1867, 42 forts covered the major harbors along the coastline. While most of the forts were completed, several of the forts, mostly in New England, were still under construction. A few of these forts, such as Fort Preble, Fort Tarleton, and Fort Constitution, were readied for armament even though they were far from complete. The Corps of Engineers listed the forts from northeast to southwest, then to the Pacific coast. The same order is used here for the new construction forts of the third system: Penobscot River, Maine, Fort Knox; Popham Bay, Maine, Fort Popham; Portland Harbor, Maine, Fort Gorges; Fort Camel, Fort Preble; Portsmouth, New Hampshire, Fort McClary; Fort Constitution; Boston Harbor, Massachusetts, Fort Warren; Fort Independence, New Bedford, Massachusetts; Fort at Clark's Point; Newport, Rhode Island; Fort Adams; New London, Connecticut; Fort Trumbull; New York City, New York; Fort Schuyler; Fort Totten; Fort Tompkins; Fort Richmond; Fort Hamilton; Fort on Sandy Hook, New Jersey; Patch Island, Delaware; Fort Delaware; Baltimore Harbor, Maryland; Fort Carroll; Washington, District of Columbia; Fort Washington; Norfolk, Virginia; Fort Monroe; Fort Calhoun; Beaufort, North Carolina; Fort Macon; Wilmington, North Carolina; Fort Caswell; Charleston, South Carolina; Fort Sumter; Savannah, Georgia; Fort Pulaski; St. Mary's River, Florida; Fort Clinch; Key West, Florida; Fort Taylor; Dry Tortugas, Florida; Fort Jefferson; Pensacola Bay, Florida; Fort Pickens; Fort Barrancas; Advanced Redoubt; Fort McCree; Mobile Bay, Alabama; Fort Morgan; Fort Gaines; New Orleans, Louisiana; Fort Massachusetts; Fort Pike; Fort Wood; Fort Jackson; Fort Livingston; San Francisco Bay; Fort Point; Fort Alcatraz. In addition, several towers and batteries were constructed in support of the forts or at lesser harbors. First and second system forts were renovated during the system as well, and readied for the larger cannon prevalent during that period. Civil War. Again, changes in technology affected design. The higher velocity ordnance of new rifled cannons crushed and penetrated the masonry walls of third system forts. Severe damage was inflicted to forts on the Atlantic coast during the Civil War. For example, Fort Sumter in South Carolina was bombarded into surrender by Confederate batteries in 1861, and reduced to rubble during Union efforts towards its recapture. In 1862, Fort Pulaski in Georgia was forced to surrender after only 30 hours of bombardment with rifled cannon, primarily primarily large-caliber Parrott rifles. Many of the larger smoothbore cannon were rifled and equipped with breech bands to support larger powder charges and extend their effective range. During the Civil War, this process is referred to as banded and rifled. During the Civil War, naval officers learned that the steamships and ironclad vessels could run past Confederate-held third system forts with acceptable losses, such as at Mobile Bay. The urgencies of war required that new forts or improvements be constructed quickly and at low cost. Partially completed third system forts were finished, but new construction was mostly wood-reveted earthworks. Frequently earthworks were built near a third system fort in order to supplement its firepower, but often they were standalone fortifications. In some cases, cannon from masonry forts were dispersed to earthen bunkers where they were better protected. The fortification of San Francisco Bay is a good example, where the typical third system fort point at the mouth of the bay was effectively replaced by dispersed earthworks and low-walled fortifications. Nearby on Alcatraz Island, Angel Island, the Marin Headlands, and Fort Mason. Following the war, work on masonry forts ended in 1867, leaving several incomplete. Minefields during the Civil War. Underwater mines, at the time called a torpedo, became an important supplementary defense measure. The Confederacy, without a large navy to protect its harbors, relied on mines extensively to deter attacks by Union ships. Coast artillery weapons. During the Civil War, numerous types of Seacoast artillery were used in the Civil War, except for the 20-inch Rodmans, of which only 3 Army weapons were built. The following list includes only widely deployed weapons. See siege artillery in the American Civil War for more information. Smoothbore weapons, 32-pounder and 42-pounder Seacoast guns, 8-inch and 10-inch Columbiads, 8-inch, 10-inch, 15-inch and 20-inch Rodman guns. Rifled weapons, rifled and banded variants of 8-inch, 10-inch, and other smoothbore guns. 6.4-INCH 8-inch and 10-inch Parrott rifles, 6.4-INCH and 7-inch Brooke rifles. Post-Civil War to the creation of the Coast Artillery Corps. After the war, construction for several new third system forts began in New England. These were to be built of stone rather than brick, and designed to accommodate the large bore cannon developed during the war. However, in 1867 money for masonry fortifications was cut off, and the third system came to a close. The vulnerability of masonry to rifled cannon and large-caliber smoothbore cannon and fewer concerns for invasion led to the construction of well-dispersed masonry revetted earthen fortifications with brick-lined magazines, often located near third system forts. These were typically armed with 15-inch Rodman guns and 8-inch converted rifles. In some cases, the forts were also rearmed with these weapons. All of the larger Parrott rifles had burst frequently during the war, so few of these were retained in service after the war. Also during the 1870s, a number of new projects were started to include large-caliber mortars and submarine mines. However, the facilities for the mortars and mines were never completed, and funding for the new fortifications was cut off by 1878, leaving much of the program unfinished. By the 1880s, most of the earthen fortifications were in disrepair. Monitors for coast defense. Though coastal defense was generally within the purview of the Army, the Navy became more involved in the late 19th century with coastal defense ships, generally called monitors. These monitors were turreted ironclad warships inspired by US Monitor, as well as coastal ships which closely followed her design. The term monitor also encompassed more flexible breastwork monitors which had a modest armored superstructure and were thus more seaworthy. These also featured modern rifled breech-loading guns. Monitor-style ships were used extensively in offensive roles during the Civil War, but were impractical for ocean service and offensive action abroad. They were, however, ideally suited for harbor defense with their shallow draft and large guns. Post-war, Civil War-era monitors were dispersed to important harbors, including San Francisco on the West Coast. For the 1870s to the 1890s, larger and more powerful breastwork monitors were produced, such as the Amphitrite class, while the ocean-going Navy was slow to make the transition to steel hulls and armor plating. An improvement on the monitor concept was the coastal battleship, such as the Indiana class of the 1890s. As a result of the Spanish-American War and the acquisition of Hawaii and the Philippines by 1900, the Navy was committed to ocean-going battleships, and ceased building monitors. However, some of the vessels remained in service up to World War I in combat-prepared roles, and as training or auxiliary vessels thereafter. Coast artillery weapons between the Civil War and Endicott period. The Endicott program was largely implemented 1895 to 1905. As Endicott facilities were constructed in each harbor defense area, the previous coastal defenses were usually abandoned. Only widely deployed weapons are listed. The larger Parrott rifles had shown a tendency to burst during the war, so only a few were retained in service after the war, in emplacements that took advantage of their long range 10-inch and 15-inch Rodman smoothbore guns. 8-inch Rodman converted rifles. Endicott period. In 1885, President Grover Cleveland appointed a joint Army, Navy, and civilian board, headed by Secretary of War William Crowninshield Endicott, known as the Board of Fortifications. The findings of the board illustrated a grim picture of existing defenses in its 1886 report and recommended a massive $127 million construction program of breech-loading cannons, mortars, floating batteries, and submarine mines for some 29 locations on the U.S. coastline. Most of the board's recommendations were adopted. Prior efforts at harbor defense construction had ceased in the 1870s. Since that time, the design and construction of heavy ordnance in Europe had advanced rapidly, including the development of superior breech-loading and longer-range cannon, making the U.S. harbor defenses obsolete. In 1883, the Navy had begun a new construction program with an emphasis on offensive rather than defensive warships. These factors combined to create a need for improved coastal defense systems. The Endicott Board's recommendations led to a large-scale modernization program of harbor and coastal defenses in the United States, especially the construction of modern reinforced concrete fortifications and the installation of large-caliber breech-loading artillery and mortar batteries. Typically, Endicott period projects were not fortresses, but a system of well-dispersed emplacements with a few large guns in each location. The structures were usually open-topped concrete walls protected by sloped earthworks. Many of these featured disappearing guns, which sat protected behind the walls, but could be raised to fire. Controlled minefields were a critical component of the defense, and smaller guns were also employed to protect the minefields from minesweeping vessels. An extensive fire control system was developed and provided for the forts of each coast artillery district. Most of the Endicott fortifications were constructed from 1895 through 1905. As the defenses were constructed, each harbor or river's installations were controlled by coast artillery districts, renamed Coast Defense Commands in 1913 and Harbor Defense Commands in 1925. By the outbreak of the Spanish-American War in April 1898, the Endicott program had completed only a few batteries at each harbor. Following the explosion and sinking of Maine on the 15th of February, an act of Congress of the 9th of March 1898 authorized the construction of batteries that could be rapidly armed at numerous East Coast locations. Completion of Endicott batteries and refurbishment or redeployment of 1870s batteries were also included. It was feared that the Spanish fleet would bombard U.S. ports. The principal new weapons deployed were 21 8-inch M1888 guns on modified 1870s Rodman gun carriages, 8 6-inch Armstrong guns, and 34 4.72-inch Armstrong guns, the latter two types purchased from the United Kingdom to provide some modern quick-firing medium-caliber guns. As none of the Endicott program's 6-inch or 3-inch batteries had been completed, field artillery, primarily 5-inch siege guns and 7-inch siege howitzers, was also deployed, mostly in Georgia and Florida. Many of these batteries were not completed until 1899, after the war was over, and the 8-inch guns were withdrawn within a few years as modern emplacements for them were completed. 1901 reorganization. Robert Fulton used the term torpedo to describe an underwater explosive device in 1805. Samuel Colt experimented with electrical firing of the torpedo. Electrically fired torpedoes, later termed mines, controlled from mine casemates ashore, were associated with coastal fortifications. As early as 1882, the need for heavy fixed artillery for seacoast defense was noted in Chester A. Arthur's second annual message to Congress as follows: I call your attention to the recommendation of the Secretary and the Board that authority be given to construct 2 more cruisers of smaller dimensions and 1 fleet dispatch vessel, and that appropriations be made for high-power rifled cannon for the torpedo service and for other harbor defenses. Army leaders realized that heavy fixed artillery required different training programs and tactics than mobile field artillery. Prior to 1901, each of the 7 artillery regiments contained both heavy and light artillery batteries. In February 1901, with the Endicott program well underway, the Artillery Corps was divided into 2 types: field artillery and coast artillery. The previous 7 artillery regiments were dissolved, and 30 numbered companies of field artillery and 126 numbered companies of coast artillery were authorized. 82 existing heavy artillery batteries were designated as coast artillery companies, and 44 new CA companies were created by splitting existing units and filling the ranks with recruits. The company-based organization was for flexibility, as each harbor defense command was differently equipped and a task-based organization was needed. The coast artillery would alternate between small unit and regimental organization several times over its history. The head of the Artillery Corps became the Chief of Artillery in the rank of Brigadier General, with jurisdiction over both types of artillery. The coast artillery became responsible for the installation and operation of the controlled mine fields that were planted to be under observation, remotely detonated electrically and protected by fixed guns. With that responsibility, the Corps began to acquire the vessels required to plant and maintain the mine fields and cables connecting the mines to the mine casemate ashore, organized as a submarine mine battery within the Harbor Defense Command. The larger vessels, mine planters, were civilian crewed until the creation of the U.S. Army Mine Planter Service and Warrant Officer Corps to provide officers and engineers for the ships designated as mine planters in 1918. The mine component was considered to be among the principal armament of coastal defense works. By the end of World War II, such fixed coastal defenses were obsolete and the artillery branches were merged in 1950, with some of the mine planter vessels being transferred to the Navy and designated auxiliary mine layer. Coast artillery weapons of the Endicott period. These weapons were emplaced around 1895 to 1905. Only widely deployed weapons are listed. Most except the mortars, 3-inch guns, and some 6-inch guns were on disappearing carriages, with barbette carriages used for the remainder. Although some harbor defenses in less threatened locations were abandoned in the World War I era, many of these weapons remained in service until superseded by 16-inch guns and scrapped during World War II. 12-inch gun M1888, M1895, M1900, 12-inch mortar M1886, M1890, 10-inch gun M1888, M1895, M1900, 8-inch gun M1888, 6-inch gun M1897, M1900, M1903, 3-inch gun M1898, M1902, M1903.